Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I don't do well with introductions. I generally put my hand on my wallet. And I know that took a second. But when it comes from someone like Leo, it really means a lot to me. And I very much appreciate it. I appreciate Stephanie for inviting me here. It's a tremendous honor. And it's always good to be in Canada, where I hear Process pronounced so beautifully, compared to the way that we do in the United States. How much time do we have, Stephanie? Okay. I'm going to say a few things, but actually when I'm in this kind of environment, I'm actually more jazzed when there's a discussion. And so I'm going to lay out some ideas, and then I hope that we have sufficient time where you can ask questions or offer comments as long as you agree with me. Stephanie said that she wanted me to bring hope. So I thought at that point maybe we needed to cancel the meeting. But in all seriousness, I actually believe I am going to bring a message of hope, but it's going to come packaged differently than you might expect. And in framing the situation, talking about what kind of labor movement we need, I actually want to start with a movie. And the movie was called The Flight of the Phoenix. It came out, it was a book, and then followed by a movie. It's been, there was a new version of it about 10 years ago. The original version starred Jimmy Stewart, Ernest Borgnine, Richard Attenborough. It was an incredible film, and one that I would strongly recommend that you see, just on its own merits. So I want to take you through this film for a second. It takes place with this air transport that's flying through the Libyan desert, and it encounters this incredible sandstorm that leads to it crashing. And once it is crashed, it's crashed in the middle of the Libyan desert, in the middle of nowhere. And it becomes very clear to Jimmy Stewart, the pilot, that this plane is not taking off. And again, so the question then is, what are they going to do? So the survivors have, at least in their mind, two choices. One, there's a British military officer there who volunteers to try to walk out of the desert, and maybe with someone else, and to try to secure help. But most of the survivors basically conclude that they should sit under the wing in the shade and wait for help, or wait till die. One of the survivors, though, happens to be an aircraft designer, this German aircraft designer. And he's walking around the plane and making notes, and then ultimately goes to Jimmy Stewart and says, "We have the makings of another plane, and that we actually can create another plane. That this plane, the original plane, is not taking off, and it cannot be rebuilt, but that actually the makings of another plane are here. And that the parts are there, and we can actually put something together that will fly us out of the desert." And they succeed. Now you have to see the film, but they succeed. Now I start there because, in my opinion, after years of work in many efforts to reform the U.S. trade union movement, I've come to the conclusion it can't happen. That the movement, the construction of this particular thing that was initiated in the late 19th century, revised through the uprising of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that this movement can't take off again as it has been. This, for me, is very emotional, It's very, very difficult. It's been very difficult for me to accept. During the 90s, Leo mentioned that I worked in the Service Employees International Union and then in the AFL-CIO. And I was involved in a number of different efforts to carry out reforms. And one of the things that I started to realize was that metaphorically, we were facing two challenges. One was reinflation, that is, reinflating a tire. And the problem with that is that you can keep reinflating a tire, but at a certain point, you're going to have a catastrophic blowout unless you repair fundamentally the tire or replace it. The other problem that we were experiencing was new wine in old bottles. And this was one of the fascinating outcomes of a lot of the organizing that was going on, that we were bringing people in, but we weren't fundamentally changing the institutions themselves. And thus the new wine became contaminated by the old bottles. People came in, sometimes very militantly, but they'd come in and they'd enter into a particular framework of the trade union movement, and they would then begin to adopt that same framework. A classic example of this took place in Los Angeles in 1995 with a Service Employees International Union local, where workers, largely immigrant workers in the janitorial industry, were brought into a local through very active militant organizing, only to, once they got in, want the union to service them in a traditional way. And it was recognizing this that I came to the conclusion that actually we have to construct something quite new and different, but the parts are there. And that's when I said before this issue of hope, that I am actually quite hopeful, because I actually believe that the parts are there, but there's a piece or a factor that I want to get into which I don't think enough attention has been paid to. Let me just give you an example. You have in New York this phenomenal experiment called the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, an organization of essentially contract workers, because the taxi industry has been changed so that the taxi drivers are independent contractors. As such, in the United States, they have no legal right to unionize. And the union that did at one point represent them was broken. And despite that, under the leadership of a remarkable person named Baravi Desai, they constructed an organization which in effect is a union that doesn't have collective bargaining, but has built power among thousands of taxi workers, incredible base of support. And the kind of bargaining they do is bargaining through exerting various forms of power, but it's not legally collective bargaining. The Chicago Teachers Union, under a reform leadership, carried out a remarkable strike. And it was particularly remarkable because in the lead up to that strike, everybody knew they were going to get destroyed. Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, made it fairly clear that if they went on strike, they would be destroyed. And you didn't want to tackle with Rahm Emanuel. The only problem is the teachers didn't know that they were going to be destroyed. And so they then constructed a mechanism, a process, to lay the foundation for an incredible strike. Because what they did is, through internal education and then through their work with the community, they were able to win the support of the parents. Thus, when they went on strike, it became a strike for the kids. And they won. They did not lose the support of the community. And Rahm Emanuel had to put his tail between his legs. And in fact, the opinion polls right now in Chicago are somewhere around, he's about 29%, and the leader of the teachers union is considering running for mayor of Chicago. You have seriously, The National Domestic Workers Alliance merged out of domestic workers' efforts in New York City that then started to spread to other parts of New York State. Again, not a traditional collective bargaining model, but building an organization among workers who legally are not entitled to unionize. And built this through a combination of coalition building, real serious organizing at the base, and this is an organization of women. And I say that because it's interesting, when you talk about domestic workers, sometimes, I mean, in the back of our mind, we know that this is largely a female workforce. But this is an organization of women that has a potential to become more than just an organization of domestic workers, but a real voice of working women. We have the Worker Center movement that begins to emerge roughly in late 1980s, 1990s, largely among immigrant workers, largely among the poor, in many cases people that legally weren't entitled to organize. And this began to proliferate around the United States, and there's linkages that have started to be built among them and between them and the union movement, resulting in something called the United Worker Congress, which brings a number of unorthodox labor formations, so-called alt-labor, together. One of those is something called the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, NDLON, largely based in Chicago, in the southwest of the United States, in California, and rooted among Latino immigrants. Leo mentioned Jane McAlevey. One of the things and one of the reasons that she's a hero of mine was the work that she did in the late 90s when she was at the AFL-CIO in a project that the AFL called the Geographic Organizing Effort. And this was a very interesting experiment, which was unfortunately shut down because of pressure by the affiliates. But the idea behind it was right on. The idea was that while there needed to be organizing that was generated by the international unions, there also needed to be geographic organizing that was done, rooted with central labor councils, but that would be sort of a different driver force. And what Jane did as the leader of this in Stamford, Connecticut, was that she made this effort of organizing, where they organized thousands of workers in Stamford. She made the issue of unionization an issue of economic development for the people of Stamford, for the poor of Stamford. She linked union organizing with the demands of the poor, the demands for housing, et cetera, thus building a real justice campaign. Leo also mentioned the work in Nevada, which was done against the odds. Nevada is a right-to-work state. And despite that, Jane and other leaders in Nevada were able to not only win unionization, but win union membership that was well above 50% in a situation where workers were not obligated to join unions. The United Auto Workers, which is not exactly known in the recent past for being at the vanguard of innovation. I'm putting that nicely, we got the camera on. However, has been engaging in an interesting experiment in Mississippi, where they're organizing a Nissan transplant. The organizing director for the UAW is a guy named Richard Bensinger. Used to be the organizing director for the AFL-CIO, very creative. And part of what they did is that they started tapping into the black community, making the organizing of Nissan a community issue. And within that, they started to identify students, black students in the South, to turn this into an issue of justice for them. And this is something that UAW would never have considered for years. And yet we have something in motion, despite the setback in Chattanooga. In Lynn, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, the Central Labor Council, led by a guy named Jeff Crosby, who happens to be a friend of mine, envisioned a different role for the Central Labor Council and began to build a linkage with community-based organizations, and it's called the New Lynn Coalition, which is an attempt it's along the lines of what Gapasine and I call for, and I'll talk about some later, a working people's agenda and working people's assemblies to basically bring together various social forces that are actually going to fight for power at their level. You have Minnesota for a Fair Economy, which has been engaging in fights to raise the minimum wage, but also fights around the organizing of fast food workers. The United Steelworkers a few years ago shook everybody by carrying out a pact with the Mondragon cooperatives from the Basque region of Spain and actually making the issue of economic development and unorthodox economic development through worker cooperatives something that they wanted to introduce into their program. And then the AFL-CIO, about 10 years ago, initiated something called Working America, which is a program led by Karen Nussbaum, the founder of 9 to 5, the organization of women office workers from the 1970s. And Working America is a formation that is looking to organize workers who happen not to be in unions and to organize them in communities, to engage in political action, to engage in various kinds of solidaristic behavior. Now, I went through all that for two reasons. One was to convince you that I'm not pessimistic. And the second is to point out that the parts are there. They're there. But what's missing? Well, what's missing is the aircraft designer. See, when the plane crashes in the Libyan desert, the parts were there, but had you not had that aircraft designer, they all would have died. What was needed was someone that had the vision and the skills in order to help to organize this so that people understood, yes, we have the parts and we actually have a chance. In social movements, one of the big mistakes that we make is that we expect that things are going to on their own cascade. I don't know whether this is true in Canada. It is absolutely the case in the United States that you have various struggles that take place. And at the end of the struggle, it's like we're sitting on the edge of our seat expecting that we're going to see more and more of these struggles. In 2008, early 2009, there was a takeover of a factory in Chicago, Republic Windows and Doors. And when that takeover was successful, people were writing and saying, now we're going to see takeovers around the country in response to the recession and the response to the shutdowns. It didn't happen. The Watsonville cannery struggle that took place in the 80s, that was a victory largely among Latino workers. And people said, now we're going to see more of this. It didn't happen. These do not cascade on their own. That is a misreading of history. They don't cascade like that. There has to be an additional force. There has to be a way of pulling these things together as well as preaching and not simply, preaching is not the correct word, educating people as to the lessons from these. You can see the victory of Republic Windows and Doors, but that doesn't necessarily lead you to believe that that model can be replicated in your hometown, right? The facts don't speak for themselves. People speak and people interpret. And that's why there's the absolute need for the aircraft designer, right? That's why it's not enough to say, yes, we've got the parts, right? And the parts are either going to assemble on their own or that we can somehow figure out a way to do it. It's not, it doesn't work that way. We need a mechanism, and therein lies the critical importance of a left. That when you look at the great uprisings of labor, and I'm speaking from a US perspective, what you see is that there is the presence of a left. But this is not just true in the United States, this is true globally. That what is unfortunate, and it relates to the anti-communism it relates to the politics of the Cold War, that we don't discuss this. The reality is that central to almost all of these major insurgencies, there is a left, whether in the form of one party, several parties, various collectives, or whatever. There's an article that I was going to cite at the end, but I'm going to cite it here, by a guy named Michael Johns, called Winning for Losing, a new look at Harry Bridges and the big strike of 1934. It concerns the man who went on to form the International Longshore and Warehouse Union on the West Coast in the United States and Canada, and the 1934 general strike. Now, Harry Bridges, for years, was red-baited. Harry Bridges died in 1990 and claimed that he was not a communist. But apparently, someone opened up some archives in the Kremlin, and they found out he probably was. But what's interesting was not simply that actually the members really didn't care whether he was a communist or not, because he was their guy. But what this article looked at was that central to the creation of this great general strike and the building of a new union was a left. It wasn't just that these workers had been run over for years and decided to advance a union process. There was a core of leftists there that were working patiently to actually bring this thing into existence. They were, in fact, the aircraft designers. They could not have done it by themselves, right? Any more than that could have worked in the flight of the Phoenix. It's not sufficient to have the aircraft designer. You have to have the aircraft designer working with others. And thus was true with the work of Harry Bridges and many other leftists in the creation of movement, and that is what we're missing. So in bringing things together, what does that mean? How can all of this come about? Well, there's three factors that I want to point to in addition to the general need for the aircraft designer. One is the issue of timing. A second is the matter of hope. And the third is organization. Let me just take them one at a time. One of the things about timing is that you never quite know when there will be some sort of insurgency, mass rising. Anyone that suggests that they predicted anything of that sort was lying. No one in 2010 would ever have predicted the Arab Spring. It just wouldn't have. Except in the sense that if you were to say, at some point there'll be an Arab Spring, which is sort of like saying a broken clock is always right twice a day, right? But in any real terms, no one could have predicted that. No one could have predicted the Occupy movement or that it would happen when it did. So the issue of timing is that we have to be flexible. We have to understand that things can happen. They can happen very quickly. And if we are not properly organized, you can miss the window. And the thing about missing the window is that when it shuts, it's very, very hard to open it up again. But the second thing is hope. That under the best of circumstances, if people lose hope, then in fact all is lost. If people fall prey to cynicism and despair, if they decide that there is no option, there's no way we're going to get out of the desert, then no matter what your strategy is, it will not resonate. But hope is not just an abstraction. It's got to be tied in with a narrative that has a realistic sense that something can actually be done. If you look at the great movements, it wasn't just that people had this abstract sense of hope, it's that they actually believed that there was the possibility of victory. If people don't believe victory is possible, they're not going to engage in the struggle. But when people think that there's even the modicum of a possibility of success, they will end up doing remarkable things. And history has many, many examples. In my own country, if you look at the civil rights movement and you look at what happened in the 1950s under incredibly adverse conditions, It was, people would say, why would people fight under incredibly repressive conditions? Part of it was a sense of hope and this belief that there actually was a possibility of victory. And this possibility is related to the third point, organization and strategy. That in these various struggles, if you look at the Montgomery boycott, for example, of 1955, it was not, contrary to the myth, a situation where this individual black woman just was tired on a particular day and decided to sit down. You had a situation where there'd been organizing for years. There was organization on the ground, and the individual in question was not the first person who had engaged in a sit-in, but she was someone who actually had a following in the community and was linked in with organization. So hope, organization, and strategy are integrally connected. With all due respect to Jesse Jackson, who repeatedly says, keep hope alive, yelling that again and again is insufficient if people are not convinced that there is a strategy that resonates with them, that there's an organization or organizations through which the struggle can be, in fact, prosecuted. So the aircraft designer, timing, hope, and organization all are essential if, in fact, we're going to carry out the transformation that needs to take place. Now, in the United States, we are paying a serious price for several things, some that was out of our control and some that was directly in our control. We're paying a price for a law in 1948, the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it very difficult to organize and to bargain contracts. It put immense constraints on workers and their unions, but it also led to the purge of large sections of the left. Most of the union movement accepted or participated in the purge of the left. And I say that when that happened, we lost our hydraulic fluid. When the union movement failed to appreciate at roughly the same time the significance of this developing black freedom movement. The irony of it is just absolutely amazing that after World War II, when the U.S. trade union movement was probably at its height, you had in place the development of a black freedom movement challenging Jim Crow segregation, legal segregation. It was beginning to emerge. It was at that point that had labor and the black freedom movement cemented a strategic alliance, we would undoubtedly be looking at a different United States. But the labor movement made a decision not to do that, which was directly linked to purging the left. So thus, while the black freedom movement was rising, the organized labor was plateauing and ultimately declining as it became more and more like a trade association rather than a trade union movement. We had a lack of independent political action on the part of our movement and greater ties with the Democratic Party and a subservience to the Democratic Party. It wasn't simply that we were tied, but a complete subservience. And then, particularly beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, a wave of concessionary contracts in manufacturing and ultimately in the public sector that led to this feeling of demoralization among the ranks. I mean, why are we going to fight in order to lose? Why do we fight in order to give back? We know that we may not be able to win, but damn it, let's fight and give it a shot. But in a wave of concessionary agreements, there was profound demoralization that afflicted us. Okay, so today, given everything that I was laying as background, there are some significant challenges, and then I want to identify more or less in wrapping this up, what I believe the kind of movement is that we need. And I just want to mention these challenges in passing. There's three in particular. One is casualization. Casualization and the rise of temporary work is something that throughout the world is becoming a major challenge to organizing. the evaporation in many places of formal workforces, the rise of the informal economy, has challenged the entire way that we've thought about organizing. So, for example, you have a situation where casual workers work side by side with the formal workers, but are legally not permitted to organize. And the union movement, at least in the United States, has not come up with a mechanism in order to address that. And that haunts us. The taxi workers, however, are onto something by their refusal to be bound by the law. And in fact, to say that essentially, to hell with the law. We're going to figure out an alternative mechanism for organizing. But obviously, that's risky. A second thing is global production. That beginning in the 1970s, with the changes in technology, it became much easier to manufacture things in any number of places around the world. And that raises some significant questions about how do we organize, and in fact, how do we bargain? The third challenge is something that's very different, and that is the rise in the global north and parts of the global south of right-wing populism and xenophobia. Now, tonight's talk is about the right, and I'm going to talk much more about that there. But what I will say here is that right-wing populism is a contending force, not only within the middle strata, but within the working class with unions. It is offering a different narrative, a different vision for what workers, particularly so-called native workers, I don't mean First Nations, I mean so-called non-immigrants. It's offering them a different vision as to how to understand why their lives are coming apart and what needs to be done about it. And at least in the United States, organized labor has failed to respond to the challenge of right-wing populism. It's in many cases even failed to name it as the toxin that it is, fearing that somehow in raising this question that that will be divisive. All right, so what sort of movement do we need? I came across this the other day. Apart from their original purposes, they, meaning unions, must now learn to act deliberately as organizing centers of the working class in the broad interests of its complete emancipation. They must aid every social and political movement tending in that direction, considering themselves and acting as the champions and representatives of the whole working class. They cannot fail to enlist the non-society men into their ranks. They must look carefully after the interests of the worst paid trades, such as the agricultural laborers, rendered powerless by exceptional circumstances. They must convince the world at large that their efforts, far from being narrow and selfish, aim at the emancipation of the downtrodden millions. Does anyone want to take a guess as to where that comes from? No guesses. See, I was going to offer some money, but see, now you move too slow. It was from Karl Marx in the First International in 1864. You know, sometimes we think that some of these ideas are new. When I saw that, I looked at it, I was sitting in my dining area, and I said to my wife, I said, Candace, it's like right here. And indeed it is. The vision that was articulated there is precisely the vision for the kind of labor movement that we actually have to be building. And as such, it is a repudiation of the plane that crashed in the desert. It's actually saying that something very different, with a different kind of vision, what Gapasine and I talk about as social justice unionism, needs to be brought into existence. It needs to be a movement that is actually fighting for power in the name of working people and engaging working people. A second aspect of this new movement is that it has to engage in collective bargaining, but not restricting itself to collective bargaining with one or several employers. Now, what do I mean by that? One is that we are going to have to, particularly in manufacturing, think global. Right now, there's something that some of you may be familiar with called international framework agreements. What these are in essence good faith agreements that global union federations, these organizations of unions in the same sector have with multinational corporations. They're good faith agreements, there's no legal binding, but they basically, the multinational corporations essentially say, we're agreeing to be good boys and girls, and we will let people organize, we will give them certain basic rights, et cetera. We have to go beyond that, and what is ultimately going to be demanded is some sort of global collective bargaining, actually bargaining. Now, for many of us in the global north, this is going to be particularly a challenge because of the rampant chauvinism that exists within the global north, and particularly in my own country. You know, the idea that US trade unions need to sit side by side with their comrades from Vietnam, right, from Lesotho, from Ecuador, and bargain with the same company, that means that people are going to have to engage on the basis of mutual respect. And for many of the unions in my own country, that's going to be a major challenge. So one is that we've got to think at the level of global bargaining. A second thing is capturing geographic markets. And this is where you may have watched or heard about some of the fast food organizing. The fast food organizing is very interesting. If we have time, I'll go into that later. But it's very, very interesting. But the problem is that it is unlikely that there'll be a collective agreement with each of those individual McDonald's, Burger Kings, et cetera. On the other hand, they may be able to convince the industry as a whole to certain basic standards. And that would be a tremendous victory. Or if they're not able to convince the industry, they may be able to convince the powers that be through the various kinds of social disruption that there needs to be a geographic, a regional, a municipal agreement of some sort. And so I think that's a second factor. A third thing in terms of what kind of movement is the fight for local power. I'm not going to reiterate this, but it goes back to what Gapasine and I talked about in terms of bringing together organizations that are rooted among workers to create a strategic alliance that fights to actually win power. We need to be building, a fourth thing, building institutions. And this means re-entering the world of worker cooperatives. It means thinking at the level of alternative economic strategies. One of the unfortunate things, and it's still very prevalent in the United States, is the idea that unions should not engage in discussions about economic development strategy, that we should simply organize workers that are there as a result of what capital does. I'm arguing no, that we should be engaged in a fight around economic strategy. What kind of businesses are brought in? What are the conditions? The wage rates, everything, environmental issues. A fifth thing is the issue of strategic organizing. Much of the union movement in the US has gotten away from strategic organizing since the early 1950s, and instead mainly engages in hot shop organizing, just organizing wherever, sort of willy-nilly, or organizing in order to simply increase their numbers, but not thinking strategically about how to build power in those industries. So it means thinking very carefully about either a long-term commitment to an industry or a long-term commitment to a particular geography. And within that, another point is the continued importance of organizing the South and the Southwest, which can only be done through the unions linking with social movements. During the 1988 presidential campaign, Jesse Jackson had the slogan, in one hand I have a union card, and in the other I have a voting card. And ultimately, that really is what it's about in organizing in the South and the Southwest, tapping into the Black freedom movement, tapping into the Chicano movement in the Southwest, and making unionization a mechanism that's fighting for real emancipation. Two other areas are cultural and educational. On the cultural front, I don't know what union culture is like in Canada, but I can say in the United States, we're sort of trapped in either no kind of culture or sort of rehashes of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, right? And thinking that union culture is someone standing in front of you with a guitar singing a song based on struggles from Appalachia, right? There's no sense of culture, meaning everything from hip hop to spoken word to murals, and really rethinking, in part because the union movement, with very rare exceptions, doesn't create the space and doesn't encourage cultural workers to move forward. It's often viewed, I think in part, it's still a reflection of the thinking from the Cold War, that some of these artists may get a bit out of control and start coming up with some things that get people upset. But the reality is that our culture has essentially mummified in our union movement, and there's no movement that goes anywhere without deeply linked with creative culture, both inspired by as well as inspiring. But we also need education. And education is not about buildings. It really, at a basic level, needs to be about the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of barefoot educators, to borrow from a term that was used in China about doctors. Right? We need barefoot educators. We need educators that are going to workplaces, that are going to worker centers, that are going to community centers, that are engaging people in discussions, because we're dealing with adults. So it's not mainly about speeches, but it's about engaging people in discussions about what it is that's happening and helping workers make some sense out of the nonsense that seems to be knocking them over the head on a regular basis. And finally, we need to be turning the labor movement into both a movement of its components as well as a movement that's more than the sum of its parts. Karen Nussbaum, who I mentioned before, the head of Working America, would frequently say that the labor movement is the largest movement of working women in the United States. But you never think about it like that. You never think about it as a women's movement. I mean, if you think about the union movement, frequently you think about women coming into the movement, but a movement dominated by men, but rarely do we think about this is a movement of working women. What needs to happen for it to think and position itself differently? And so when we're thinking about a new union movement, that is, I guess, the other point. I'm running out of time, so let me just jump to the end. That to end with this emphasis on the issue of timing and urgency. I was talking with some people last night, and I was saying that one of the problems that afflicts many of us is that we actually don't have a sense of urgency, yet we have a lot of anxiety. In the union movement in the United States and in my own union, there's an immense amount of anxiety. We worry about everything, everything. You know, every day there's an email to worry us about what the Republicans are going to do. Yet it doesn't translate into urgency. It doesn't translate into a recognition that we actually need to understand that right now we have a limited amount of time to create that new plane. We're not going to have endless amount of water. The sun is beating down on us. Food is running out. If we do not move quickly, the opportunity is gone. And in our situation as a union movement, if we do not move with great speed, and it doesn't mean move stupidly, the opportunity will be gone. I particularly worry about the dangers that come from the right and right-wing social movements that start to appeal to more and more of our base with incredible irrational views. They're completely irrational. Nevertheless, they speak to the anger that's out there. And if we think that we have endless time, then we are engaged, in fact, in self-deception. Fortunately, I've retained my optimism and believe that we actually can create that plane and fly ourselves out of that desert. Thank you.